Okay. So if you'll remember right, one of the things that we saw, we've kind of got this project started, and we see that, anytime you, as I kind of mentioned, anytime you refresh the page, like your login gets lost, right? So I'm going to pull up the pet adoption, and we can kind of, I'm going to do it here. If you want to go ahead and do this on your issue tracker, if you're going to code along, I would recommend just coding along on the issue tracker project directly, since this is going to transfer over directly, really, with whatever project you're working on, verbatim. So I need to close a few things out here, and I need to go to my terminal, npm run start, get it up and running. We can see where we're at. So the specific kind of behavior that we're looking at is, let's say I go log in, right? Oh, I need to have my backend running too. I forgot about that. So let me get the backend up and running. npm run start dev. Okay, my backend's running there. Try to log in again. Okay, there we go. So we can see up in the top left, right, that is showing me my email address, and it's kind of indicating to me that I'm logged in, right? And if I'm currently on the pet list, if I refresh, I'm going to stay on that same page, but notice as soon as I refreshed, I lost that state. So the login button's back. It's not showing my email address. So when we think about, we solved one problem earlier in that it always went back to the login page, right? And we solved that partially by using React Router, right? So rather than keeping that state, right, in our state variables, we're using the URL, right? So when you refresh, the URL doesn't yet reset, and versus all the state variables do. And so the main problem right now is that we're storing the auth token only in state, right? Only in state. And so state goes away as soon as you refresh the page. Do I have everybody's attention? So what we want to do is figure out another mechanism to store that token, to persist it, okay? And historically, the only way we've had to save data on the client has been through cookies, right? Historically, that was the only mechanism, the only thing that existed, okay? With the advent of HTML5, which has been about 10 years now, we got some new methods. So there's some new ways to store data that have arisen in the last 10 years, okay? Now, we're going to be just talking about one of them. There are, in fact, like 3 different ways to do it now, beyond just cookies, that are worth mentioning. So there's other ways that you can do this very same thing, but there's a new system called local storage, is what I want to talk about. So in a lot of ways, local storage is very similar to cookies, with some differences. So in terms of local storage, one difference is that local storage does not expire. Cookies always have some sort of expiration date. You always have to say this cookie is going to expire either when you close the browser down or after a certain period of time. Right, now that certain period of time can be 20 years. There's no problem with that. Like, you can tell a cookie that this has a 20-year life. The browser won't complain. Local storage, on the other hand, never has any sort of expiry. So it's basically permanent. Is everybody hearing me with that? So that's one important thing to understand, is the only way that local storage goes away is really if the user chooses to go into their browser and delete the local storage. Okay? Otherwise, those things are not going to go away. So that means things like, one of the downsides of this is going to be that our tokens are persistent, right? They're going to be there long term. So our token, remember, only has a limited lifetime. So we said, hey, the token's good for a day. Well, if you come back tomorrow, the token's still going to be there, right? But it will be expired. It will be invalid. Is everybody good with that? So that's one gotcha, right? We put this in. Tomorrow you're probably going to come in and it's going to sit till you 401 error because you'll have the token still in there, but the token will have expired tomorrow. Okay. So if you see a 401 error tomorrow, log out, log back in, and we'll fix it. Cool? Okay. Because that's probably going to happen for you tomorrow. So it doesn't expire. In terms of how it stores data, they're stored as key value pairs. Where the key has to be a string, and the value, if I remember right, also has to be a string. So it is a little bit limited in that sense. You can say, here's a string, here's the name of the key, and here's the value of that. That's all you've got. So it's, in some sense, it's a little bit like a database, but it's like what we would call a key value store database. It's not a SQL, it's not a relational database. It's not even it's not even our like Mongo document database. It's strictly a key value store. And that does fit in and is considered a NoSQL database. It's a variant of NoSQL. But that's the limits. Cool. Which in some sense is very, very similar to cookies because cookies is the same story. It's a key and a value. They just have an expiration date associated with them and other options. Okay? So that's part of what's different. The other side is they just have a larger storage in it. Cookies, because they're inherently meant to be small, have some pretty narrow limits to how much data you can put in it. And for performance, they really have to be small. Yeah.
Is there any limits on the types of data you can store in local storage?
String, right? Key has to be a string. The value has to be a string. So that's your limits, right? That does mean you can store JSON because JSON is a string, right? Which means that technically you can store arrays and objects as long as you convert them to JSON first, right? And then when you pull them back out, you just have to decode that JSON. Okay. So the storage limits are there. The other thing is that it's not accessible to the back end. So in terms of cookies, generally speaking, cookies can be read both from, cookies can be accessed, read, and written from the front end as well as the back end. Both sides can see the cookie, see the contents, and change what's in there. Local storage, on the other hand, is only accessible in the front end. You can't get access to it on the back end. It's only there in the front, which actually is a good thing, right? That does mean anything we put in local storage has kind of a narrow scope. Like the only place you can get to it is if you're running code on that client's computer, right? That's the only way you get access to it. But any JavaScript running, that is worth mentioning, any JavaScript running on your code, on your front end, can access it. So also don't let nasty people put their own code onto your website because they'd be able to access that local storage. Same story with cookies, really, right? So we do want to avoid getting what we would call an XSS attack where they're running JavaScript for you. Okay. So those are the differences you have to understand. So everybody good with that? Between cookies and local storage. Okay. Now, the good news is that the API for local storage is really pretty darn simple. Okay. So it's globally available in the browser. Let me pull this back up here. And there's really only a few methods you need to know. So the way you get to the object is local storage. It's worth mentioning not all browsers have this enabled. Not all browsers have it available. Specifically older browsers, if you're using older versions of Internet Explorer, this will not be available. All modern browsers have it. Okay. So oftentimes we do need to check that it's available before we use it, But at this point, it's pretty safe to just assume, generally just assume that everybody does. Okay. So we don't do too much coding for older devices that don't support it anymore. All right, so it's accessible via variable, a global variable called local storage. And you'll notice there's an uppercase S there for that. There's only a few methods you need to know. So often local storage, we can say local storage dot get item, which takes a key, okay, and that will give us the value that's currently stored at that key, or undefined or null if there's nothing there, right? If the key hasn't been set, that's just going to give you back more value. So otherwise, we also want to be able to set keys. Which is take the key, put the value in there, and if we want to remove something out of there, it's literally just remove acid. That's the whole API you need to know about. Is we read it with get item, we can write a key, we can write a value with set item, or we can remove a key from there calling remove item. That's it. That's the whole API. 3 methods. One of the easiest probably front-end APIs you can get to. Cool?
Set items you're kind of create and update.
Yeah, both. It'll create a record as well as update a record. So if it's not there, create one. If it's already there, just replace what's there with the new value. So that's the whole thing, right? So what can we use this for? Well, you can use it to store anything, right? You can use it to store any data that you need to have locally on the client that maybe you don't need to be able to access on the back end, right? And so that enables, this enables a lot of things, right? It enables the thing that we're going to do today, which is just to store the token somewhere, right? Which is kind of the easy case. Say, okay, when you log in, we'll store the token in local storage, and when you log out, we'll remove it. And then when you refresh the page, you can kind of read it out there and restore it from there. So we're going to use it in a pretty simple sense there. It can also, it's one other thing that sometimes people use it for, is caching data. So you might say, hey, well, maybe I want to save some of these things I'm getting from the database, from the back end, and not ask for them every time. You can use them as one way to cache that data, okay, and avoid making more calls to the API. I would recommend against doing that in this project because there's a lot of gotchas with how do you cache that data, and in terms of like how much do you cache? What do you choose to cache and not cache? How do you get rid of things that are cached, right? How do you, what we say, invalidate the cache? How do you decide that the data in the cache is not good anymore, right? So there's a bunch of problems you have to solve to use it for caching, which I would not recommend you get into at this point.
So how do you kind of know like when you should cache data? Is there like examples you think like maybe want to do it?
So examples where you might want to do it. One of the questions that came up is, so let's say I'm on the pet list and then I go to the next screen, right? So I go to the pet editor. Well, in theory, I'm just asking kind of for the same data that I just had here. In reality, that's not often true. Oftentimes, this is just a small piece of the data, and there's more data that you need to go to the details or the edit page. So you may need more data, right? So that being said, you still could say, okay, if I go to this page, right, maybe I'm going to look at Fluffy a lot. So maybe I'm going to save the data, the current data of Fluffy, and cache that. I could do that, right? That would be an example of that. Again, the problem is to know when do you throw that away, right? So the problem is if you save a local copy of that and prefer that, well, what happens if some other user goes changes Fluffy and you still got this old data, right? So it can cause more problems sometimes than it solves. right? So caching is one of those really, really hard problems. It's important from a performance standpoint, especially if you're dealing with limited connectivity. If you have users that don't constantly have access to internet, or maybe internet is expensive, because some countries do meter the data. You know, if you're using a 3G, you're paying by the megabyte, then it's important. But it's kind of beyond the scope of what we can do here. So caching is one thing that you can use it for, but we don't use it here. The other side of things is, honestly, there are some apps where it doesn't make sense to have a backend, right? Most apps, largely the ones that we're building, you know, we really need this backend, and we really want to collaborate with other people, with other users. And so that collaboration, that sharing of data between different users really requires us to have a database on the back end, really requires us to have that API, right? But sometimes you're just building something that all the data needs to be local, right? All the data might be in the browser. Maybe it's just one person using it. And so it's really good for building things, maybe like web apps, that you want to kind of behave like a native app, that maybe behaves like a native app that the user has installed on their device. And so local storage is really good for supporting those kind of apps that keep most of their data locally, rather than using a service or a database to kind of host that. Does that make sense? So a very simple example of that might be, hey, a to-do list. Maybe you just want to have that to-do list locally on your phone, and you don't want to necessarily have it accessible on any other device. Then local storage might be a good place to just go ahead and save those to-do list items, right? And it's cheap. You don't have to have a backend, right? So that's part of where local storage comes in. Does that make sense? So it's very helpful, especially if you want to build web apps that look like they're native apps on your device. It's one of those that really enables us to have some very powerful apps. Okay, so let's look at the code changes that we want. Yeah, we'll kind of walk through this, and one of the things I do need to show you is how to troubleshoot your local storage. Definitely take note of this, because you're gonna probably want to check on these things. Okay, so on the server, I'm going to start by going in the source, and I'm going to go into app.js. And it turns out all the stuff I need to do for local storage strictly fits into app.js. It's actually no other files I have to touch to fix this very problem. Okay, so the first thing I need to do, and this is where I would start, is I would go into this onLogin handler that I have already. This is one of the benefits that we've already put this in, because then we can say, well, any route that you can get to that will cause you to log in, we can hook in additional features and additional pieces that we may need to do. So you'll remember the way that we hooked up register and the way we hooked up login. Both of these are calling the onLogin function, right? Or if you had some sort of password reset method, you could still call into this and have it save the token. Okay, so what I want to do in here, I'm just going to say, first of all, check that local storage is available, which is simple as just doing a truthy-falsy check, a simple if statement. If local storage isn't available, it's going to be unavailable. And so that's really all you have to do to check. So if there's local storage. Now I'm going to expand my code a little bit more to make this easier to read. So if there's local storage, we need to save something. So you'll remember that we can do local storage.setItem, right? And so then I need to specify a key and a value, right? So the key is something that we just come up with, right? What do we want to call it? We can actually call it anything. I'm going to call it auth token so that I kind of know what this is, and that way if I have other tokens, I know this one is the one I'm using for authentication. And then what I'm going to set here would be auth.token. Because you'll remember that what we had there Go there. Yeah. You'll remember what we had is we have this auth object inside of there. When we log in, we put the token as a kind of a field in there. So I'm not saving the entire auth object. I'm just saving the token. But that's fine because all the other things, if we look at what we put in auth, all of those other things are accessible in part of the actual payload. So when I restore this, all I need to do is just decode the token, and I can get all the other data that we had in there. So I'm just saving the token and nothing else. Okay, so that's one side of things, is I'm going to set that up to store the token. Now, if I go back to the page, I'm going to just give this a test, and we can see if this is working already. So I'm going to go to the login, right? And I'm going to go ahead and hit login, okay? So I went through successfully, no errors, but nothing really so far has happened, right? It is put it into local storage, but we haven't kind of fleshed out the whole picture yet, okay? So what I want to do is look at and show you how you can see from the browser to see that it actually has done something, okay? So I'm going to hit F12. I'm going to get into the developer tools, okay? Obviously, we've done a bit with the developer tools so far, but I want to show you a new tab. Okay, so we spent most of our time in console. First semester, you did a bit with elements, and you maybe have stumbled into sources for the debugger. We've looked at network in terms of looking at network requests. There's another tab in here called application. This may or may not be the first time you've seen application. Okay, so under application, there are quite a few different kind of keys, so a few different sections here. Application in here, to kind of give you some background, this tab is really designed for things where you want to make all the things that are under this application tab are really around making applications, making web apps that are very close, if not identical, to native applications. It's kind of related to something called PWA. So this is why all these things are grouped in here, okay? So where we want to look under the application tab is we're going to go down to local storage. And you'll see that there's a domain name here because local storage is specific to the domain, right? So I can only see things within my domain from the JavaScript side, from the front end side, okay? Now, inside of there, we'll see the key that we just set, right? So we saved an auth token, and you can see the value, right? So that was the effect of calling said item, right? And so we can see and make sure that that's working by just saying, hey, let's log out. Let me log in again. If I log in again, ideally, we should see a different token. Now, I can't see it change because I wasn't looking at, I think, the end where things would change. So let me look there. VVMC is the last few characters. Log out, log in. And yeah, there we go. So I've got the new token when I log in. Now, one of the things you hopefully noticed as I was testing that is maybe you noticed that when I logged out, that my token's still there, right? That's a problem, right? We need the token to go away when you log out, okay? So that's where I also need to add something into the on log out event as well, right? So when you log in, we save the key. When you log out, we need to also delete the key, okay? Delete that token. So that's pretty simple. Go back here. I'm going to again say if there's local storage. Then we're going to say local storage dot remove item. And I'm going to use the same key as what I used up here, right? So I set item auth token, I remove item auth token down here. So that key is now appearing in two different places, okay? And they do have to be the same, right? So we say set it, remove it. Let's check that out. If I go back here, let's try to log in. Log in. And I'm going to log out, and when I log out, notice that the key went away, right? So the key under local storage is gone now. It forgot that token. Cool. So that's the first part of it, right? Is we save it when you log in and we delete it when you log out. Cool. You know, one of the things that was asked when we were working with the backend, you know, is do we need a route to log out? You don't, because this is all we have to do on the front end. So the front end, the back end really has no idea whether or not your users are logged in. It really doesn't know how many of your users are logged in. That's purely the job of the front end, right? So log in, log out. Okay. Now, for the last piece, remember what we wanted to do with this is remember that you're logged in, right? And if I log in right now, okay, yes, that token's being saved. If I refresh, the token still be there, but it's logged me out, right? So the other side of this is not only do I have to manipulate the token when you log in and log out, I have to read it when the page refreshes. Does that make sense? So when the page refreshes, I have to go actually look at that key in local storage and restore the token, right? So that's the other side of this. And the good news is that's the last piece. There's really only 3 code changes you have to do to make this work. Is change on login, on logout, and something that happens when the page loads. Cool? Okay. So in terms of doing this when the page loads, the hardest question of this is how and when do I know that the page is loaded? How do I trigger something on page load, right? Any thoughts?
Is on load for function officially?
You said an on load?
Yes, sir.
So I can't use the on loads that you used in first semester. That's not available to me. Like I can't use a document on load.
When you set the auth state, so settings to null first.
Okay.
Check if there's local storage.
Right. So you're saying up here, can I do it there?
Yeah.
I can't. Okay. And there's a few reasons why. First of all, if I did do it there, okay, it's blocking the app as long as that's running. This is in the render method, and the app would be blocked as long as I'm running the code there, which means the user's seeing a white screen, if I did get it to work there. Second of all, it's just a matter of timing. I don't necessarily want that initially. This is a bad place to put things if you need them to happen initially. Part of that is this, if I did put code in here, even though it only seems to have an effect initially, it actually would get executed every single time there's a render, which means that we would be reading local storage again and again and again and again, and would quickly make your app pretty slow. Okay, so we do not, just for reference, anytime you have stuff like this where you're declaring state variables, the value that's in here should always be constant, period. You should never put a function call, you should never put code in there that determines this value. Everybody clear with that? So this must always be a static value. Must be a compile time constant, which is why it needs to stay as null. Okay. So I need to trigger this on page load. In fact, I'm okay with it being a little bit delayed. And that's actually kind of what I want. I want the page to come up first, and it's briefly going to be there with you logged out, and then just in a flash of the eye, it'll switch over and you'll be logged in. It's the behavior I want. Okay, just so we're clear. All right. Now, the tool I'm going to use, we've actually kind of used before. Okay. You'll remember when we set up a few things, like we set up the pet list. Remember, we kind of needed that behavior. So if I looked at components pet list, you'll remember that when the pet list loaded, I wanted to populate it with the pets, right? Now, notice that the items initially, just like I'm doing with the auth, they're null. They're not there, right? But when I look at the page, and let's see what's happening, refresh, just for a blink of the eye, right, there's no pets, and then they come in. I want to do the same thing with the auth token, right? I want to take the same approach, okay? And so the approach I took, remember, what did I use to get the list populated initially when you go to the pet list? Because notice that that's null, right? Right. You can see the code there, right? I can see that call to use effect. Now, inside of that use effect, I'm using Axios because the place I need to get that data is the back end, right? So I need to make an API call to get there. But the trick I'm using to get it to happen at the right time is use effect, right? So use effect, remember, triggers on one of two events or both events. It triggers when the component is mounted, right? Mounted is when they initially comes on screen, and it also happens anytime it is updated, right? So that means, for instance, if the state changes, then it's updated, it's re-rendered. Okay, everybody good with that? So it's the same idea here, right? I want to trigger some logic when the application component is mounted, right? So I'm going to use effect. So I need to bring that in because we haven't actually used use effect in the application yet. So I'm going to say use state, use effect. I'm going to import those two things up at the top, right? And I'm going to bring it down and start to implement that below. So down here, I'm going to start to say, I can kind of ditch this old code, and I can say function, actually, sorry, not function. Oh, wait a second, function. So I'm going to call use effect. Give it a little lambda, a little arrow function. And let's just by saying console.log okay. I'm just going to log app effect first, just so we can get on the same page about when this gets called. Okay. So back to the app. Let's watch the console. Okay. So I refresh the page. You can see app effect is logged, right? It's right here. Okay. If I go to login, notice the app effect got called again, right? Because I changed to another page. Same thing if I go back to pet list. You'll notice that every time I change to a new page, that does cause the application to get updated. Okay? So everybody with that? So if I start with this, I'm going to be close to the intended effect, but not quite there, right? I'm going to be there where, yes, it does load and does it get executed when the application is mounted, but it also gets executed anytime the application is updated, which I don't want the latter. I just want it when it's initially mounted. Cool? Okay, so the trick we use is one that we've actually kind of already talked about. Remember that you can pass a second parameter to use effect, which says only run this when these state variables change, when these properties or other things, these variables are different. Okay, so in there I can pass an array and we say, okay, only do this when certain things change. Well, it turns out I only ever want to run this once. And so if I only ever want to run this once, I just put an empty array. And that will cause this to only ever be executed one time, period. Only when this component is mounted. Cool? Everybody good with that? So with that change in place, I should see in the console, if you refresh the page, you'll see app effect, but you won't see it when I navigate between pages, right? If I click through those different links in the nav bar, it's not getting run. Okay, because I only need to go and grab that token and parse the token once, period. Everybody good with that? So that's how we get this code to run only once where we want it to happen. Okay. Again, this is kind of the place where I can't use DOM content loaded because it's kind of a different trigger. I want to wait till I'm actually in the component so I can actually get to those state variables. If I was using DOM content loaded, I actually wouldn't know that the component is mounted yet and wouldn't be able to set those state variables yet. So I have to do it this way. Okay. So now let's put the code we actually want to use. Inside of there, I'm going to get rid of my log. I'm going to say if local storage, then we're gonna do some stuff with it. Okay. Remember, older browsers don't necessarily have local storage, so I'm just saying if it's not there, tough luck, you refresh and you're locked out because we can't really help it, right? If you refresh on an old version IE, you're just going to be logged out. Switch to a newer browser. It doesn't completely break things, so you just have to live with less features, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a way to gracefully degrade, as we might say. Okay, so if there is local storage, then I'm going to try and pull the token out. So I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to call this stored auth token. This is the auth token I'm pulling out of storage. And I'm going to say that equals local storage dot get item. And then I have to remember what key did I use to put that token in, right? So what key did I use when you logged in to save the token in the first place? Auth token, right? We can see it down here, right? So that same key I need to use here. So we say, let's restore the auth token, right? And if I wanted to check real quick just that that's working, console.log, and let me just quickly log the stored auth token. So if I log it, I'm going to pull this out in a minute. When I refresh, you'll see that the token appears here. So we know the code's getting executed, and we know it's pulling out the token that we had saved previously. So that much is good. Okay. Now this token by itself is it's helpful, but you'll remember when we logged in, we saved some additional data beyond just the token, right? Like I want to have a decoded version of this. I want to have the payload, right? So if we look at maybe our login component, login form, okay, you'll see here, this is how we're building up the auth object, right? So when you log in, you get an object that has your email address, your user ID, your token, and your payload, okay? So when I restore, I need to build up this exact structure so that you don't know where it came from, right? We don't want it to be different from when you go through the login form versus when it's restored from local storage. So everybody good with that? So I need to get to the same information, okay? So first things first, I need to get at the payload. Right? And then once I get at the payload, that will actually include the email and the user ID. Right? So I can pull those things out if I have the payload. Okay. Now the payload, where did that come from? That came from us decoding the token. So I'm going to do the same thing over in my code here. I'm going to decode that token that we just pulled out. Okay. So I want to say something like, get rid of that console log. So const auth payload is equal to jwt.decode, and I want to decode that stored auth token. Okay. Now you might see that JWT is in a red underline, right? When you look at that tooltip, it's going to tell you that JWT is not defined. Okay. Easy answer, we haven't imported it yet. right? So I do need to go back to the top of this file and import the JWT package. Okay, so up at the top, I don't know where the best place to put this is, so maybe I'll put it up on line 2. I'm going to import JWT from JSON Web Token. That's where that's coming from. Import JWT from JSON Web Token. Okay, so back here, all right, let's just check that that's working. Again, I kind of want to console log everything until I get to just making sure every step along the way has the intended effect. So I'm going to do console log auth payload and see that that's actually working when I refresh the page. So when you refresh the page, you should see, oh, here's the object, here's the payload, and we see it's got the email in it, we see it's got the ID, we see it's got the role, and the full name, and expiration date, all those kind of things, right? So that's what we want to see if everything is working. Right? Cool. So the next step is to build up that auth object that we want to have saved. So I'm going to say const auth is equal to a new object, and there we need to pull out and put together the same stuff that we had from building it previously. So I need the token. Token's easy. Have that stored auth token. The payload is going to be auth payload because we just decrypted that. I need the email, which is part of the payload. So that's going to be auth payload dot email, and I want the user ID is in the payload, but it's under the name underscore ID. So now I've got this auth object put back together, right? That's what we need to get back to what we had initially when we logged in. Okay. Now that I've got that, we can actually call setAuth. So now I can call setAuth, give it the auth. That's going to trigger it to refresh and show the correct stuff in the app bar. So it's just a matter of kind of figuring out, like, okay, I need to pull out local storage, I need to decode it, I need to put it back together in the same way that we had for when we logged in, right? So we can do a refresh here. We should see if I refresh, notice that I've achieved my goal, right? So when I refresh the page, it's still showing me as logged in, right? The logout button's still there, and I still got my email in the address bar. I think I'm seeing some zooming happening here. I'm not sure why. There we go. That's where I want to be. So cool. I can refresh the page and things are still there. In fact, things happen so fast that you don't even notice it flipping over for even a brief minute over to being not logged in this case. Cool. All good, right? All good, right? Problem solved. Okay, so we're close. Testing's important. Testing's important. So we've tested it, but we've only tested it under one circumstance. Okay, we've only tested it in the case of we are already logged in, right? What's the common case that people are actually going to run into when they go to your website first? They're not going to be logged in. Okay, so the code that we have here works as long as you're already logged in, and has a bit of a problem if you're not logged in. And let's see what that problem is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in I'm going to log out, okay? Logging out, no problem, right? But remember that removed our key, right? So we don't have a saved auth token anymore. When I refresh the page, the whole thing's going to come falling apart because I'm not logged in. Okay, so let's diagnose the error and let's see what we need to do to fix this. It's easy. The good news is it's easy, but it's one of those things that you have to test for. And maybe can be not obvious when you're working with local storage that you have to test for some other cases that can happen. Okay, so it says cannot read properties of null reading email. Okay, so it tells us something about what line of code caused it, right? And namely, it's kind of pointing us to, I think, line 28, if I read this right, roundish, around line 28 of my code. Okay. What does that error tell me? What information can I pull out of that error message, out of that error page? What is it telling me about what is going on?
Why did you say that email payload is null?
Okay, it's the common misconception, but it doesn't say that.
Payload?
Yes. Remember, this says not the email is null, it says the thing before it is null, right? So the auth payload is null, okay? Which we would really expect. If you're logged out, you probably should be getting a null auth payload, okay? So if I think about that here, right? Okay, so if I try to do something with auth payload is null, I get down here, the whole thing crashes, right? Because here I'm presuming both on line 28 and line 29, I'm presuming that there is an auth payload, right? And if there's no auth payload, I really shouldn't be saving this at all, right? I really shouldn't be saving this at all. So the best thing I can do is say, well, let's just not do this code if there's no payload, right? If there's not a payload for us to work with and use, I probably don't want to proceed with that. So we just say, oh, okay. So there's a case where the payload isn't there. So let's handle it. Say only do this if there is a payload. Wrap it in an if statement. Problem solved, right? Okay. So that's one thing to address. Okay. And in fact, that's enough to keep it from crashing. Just throw in an if statement in there, right? So again, it's things you have to test for, right? Things you have to test for to see, is it working in this case? Is it working when we're logged in? Okay. Now, it's kind of surprising that this still works when we're logged out. For one specific reason that I find this kind of surprising is that, well, right now, what is stored auth token? What's the value of that variable? Or null, right? Why are we trying to decode null? It's kind of surprising that the GWT, the code, doesn't throw an exception on that. In the current library, it's not, but I could foresee easily in an update to JSON Web Token that says, oh, null, I'm going to throw an exception for that because you shouldn't be able to null to decode, right? That doesn't make any sense to decode a null token. So just for safety, I might want to say, well, we also don't want to try and decode it if there's no token there, right, in the first place. So I might go a little bit further and wrap that in an if statement too. So I say only proceed with that if there is a token. If stored auth token is truthy, then we can proceed with that check. And so wrap all of that code in an if statement further. Right? I don't need to proceed with any of that code if there's no token. I don't need to proceed with this code if there's no payload. So error handling is important, right? Okay. Does that make sense? Just adding a few if statements to just make it more resilient. Okay. One more thing you might want to check. Now, this is a weird one. And this is one that probably is a lot less likely to happen than the ones we just checked. Okay. Now, when I log in, okay, remember that it sets this key auth token and it sets it to a value. Okay. That's all nice and good. Now, what if I go in here and I want to be malicious? I just type in some random characters as their token. Okay. That's a possible use case to be in, right? In this case, what should be the behavior? Well, the behavior should be, first of all, the app doesn't crash, and B, it treats you as being logged out. Cool. That's my expectation. My expectation in this case is the application doesn't crash and treats you as not being logged in, because obviously that's not a valid token. All right, let me refresh. I think it happened. Cool. Problem solved. So that's one case one thing you might want to test for. It turns out that works. And I think that what that comes down to is I'm going to assume at that point that E code is returning one.
Yeah, it didn't work for me.
Didn't work for you? What happened?
Every part is no, same problem.
It's definitely not running this code.
Yeah, this is your thing.
Okay.
So no, I'm not running it.
Yeah, you're missing your thing, right? No, I have two things. And I intentionally have
Oh, you have two. Oh, I thought you
You need both. You need both. Right?
were.
So you need to check not just the token is there, but also you need to check gateway. It's not one or the other. So the things to check for, but that's really all there is to it. Any questions there? Does that make sense in terms of like restoring the auth token? Again, the only problem that we're really trying to solve is you refresh the page and it'll log out. Yes. Yeah, they probably were. So it's as simple as this. Go to your publish. Okay. So the problem is, so initially it's loading the lock. And so that first through, it's requesting, the refresh is first going to request that doesn't come from the token. That's probably the thing. But when it tries to do it again, it's not removing the count from the first two. Right. So if it's received, so you're going outside. Similarly, so that's basically it. That's not out. You're not removing the error. It's not. Yes.
One thing, so the issue trackers, right, when we use a bug list, you want these to be logged in, right? So like it works and everything. Like those bug lists, when you refresh, they keep you logged in, right? But it still says like come up here.
So yeah, so he was having the same issue. So there's two things you want to do. Is first and foremost is if it is successful, you need to make sure you clear that error. Which that's one thing you want to definitely do, right? So go look at your list, and so that's a good thing to understand is anytime something is successful, you do. So here, you see set error here, you're not setting error in your song. Right? So on this side, you also need to say set. How would actually do it? Do you think you'll say false? Okay. And so if you do that, if you refresh it, won't initially have that way. Because then it's successful if it doesn't release. You'll notice initially it fails because it's trying to do it. It's trying to do it initially on the bug list, even though you're not logged in. Okay? So the other side of things you may want to do is tell it just not to request the bug list if there's no auth there. Right? It doesn't make sense to go request the bug list if you know it will fail. Right? So that's the thing I would recommend. Right? Is from there is tell it not to do that if you don't have an auth. Okay. So that's the bit about local storage. Questions? Is anybody having issues still where that's not working, maybe as intended? Okay. All right. So let's go and talk about deployment now. So you remember that we've already deployed our backends to Heroku. And so now we want to go through and deploy our front ends to Heroku as well. And that's going to mean on the Heroku side that you're going to have 2 applications there, 2 projects, rather than just like 1. Okay. So logging into the place to start would be to go to log into Heroku. Okay. I've got a bunch of apps up here already. In fact, I kind of played around with this this morning, so I've already got it up and running. And so like if I go to look at my app here, this is kind of where we're trying to get to. Is I can go to it, it's got a URL, and the URL to it, let me pull this up. There you go. So this is running on Heroku instead of running on my local machine, right? Which actually means that if you were to go through this on your browser, you would be able to access it, right? Unlike your local where I can't access your local server, right? So our goal is to get things on the internet, okay? So first things first, kind of like we started things before, is the first process that you want to go through is make a new app. So you're going to log into Heroku, you're going to make a new app. That new app, you're going to call something like Issue Tracker React Paul Smith. Right, that's what I would call mine. Obviously, yours is going to be a little bit different because I want to put your name in. So you should already have like an Issue Tracker Paul Smith or whatever. That's your back end. We may end up wanting to change the name on that a little bit.
It won't go further.
Yes, it can only be so long. So you may want to do like eRNAs, shorten the second part.
Yeah, I remember that. I'll put in my last one.
Yeah, that's fine. So you're going to hit create app, assume you have that name, and we'll do the next one. There, once everybody's created there. So if you go to Heroku, so we've got the little bit. Yes, we'll do it. So we got those.
I texted my last name.
It's fine. This is a really long name that we've got in there right now. Now that one, go back to the first one.
One letter, 2 lines. So no, it's an object, so we need it.
Yeah, one confirming the one. Go ahead.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a technical limit to the number of characters you can have for a URL? Or is that just Heroku being Heroku?
Yes and no. There's not some, I don't know that per the URL standard there is, but on Windows there kind of is. Windows has a limit to how long file names, file paths can be. And I believe that sometimes that applies to URLs, not all the time. So, all right, so go ahead and click Create App so you can get into there if you haven't yet. And I'm going to go back actually and go to mine that I've already created. So once you've created, you'll be presented with a screen like this. You want to go to the Deploy tab if you're not automatically put there. Okay, and so remember on the Deploy tab is how we tell it where to pull the code from. So what you're going to do is pick GitHub in the middle, just like we did with the backend. And you're going to go pick your React project, your issue tracker React project, and you're going to connect it up. Okay. You'll also want to turn on automatic deploys for this as well. So go ahead and find your issue tracker React project. There's some more stuff. Let's talk about that once we can go. So you should have automatic deploys turned on. There's one thing you want to do there. Okay. And then go ahead and go down to the bottom and deploy branch. You just do them manually. Okay. Yeah, manual deploy might very well error out. I had some issue with it when I tested it this morning, and we'll go through how it fixes it. But you want to at least take it. Yep. Yep. So if you want to take a screen expand that error. We're going to take a snapshot and toss it in Discord. You
gotta be on local storage too.
Yep. So there's a little thing that you do for the storage, you just kind of go out. Yeah.
You might come back even later yet? I thought.
What time is it now?
40.
Yeah, a little bit. We've got a few more things to do. Yeah. Maybe 30 minutes-ish.
30 minutes. We'll be back in 30 minutes.
Okay. So after doing automatic deploy, a manual deploy, pull this in. So Cody, you had that. Actually, when you put in, put that in. So what we want to do is do utility. So, more than likely, you may have seen this error. I don't remember this historically happening, but it happens sometimes. It happens in this case. You say, hey, something went wrong with the deployment, and saying something about dependencies, and basically what came down to it is that we need to specify what version of Node is this going to run against, right? Do we want what engine, what version of Node do you want to use to deploy this website? So,
How's it working on our end?
huh?
How How's it working on our end?
On your end?
Are we just never building?
Because you're using the version of Node that's running on your computer, right? You only have one version of Node installed. Heroku serves a bunch of different versions of Node based on what you need. So it needs to know what version you want. So the way you find out what version you need is first you want to go into the terminal and you're going to type in this command, node space -v, node -v. That's going to pop out something like this. It's going to pop out what version you have installed. For me, it's 16.9.1. Does anybody have a different version of that? What's your version that you have? Okay. So whatever version you have here, use that one in the next step. Don't use 16.9.1. If you have a different answer, use the different answer that you got. Cool? Is everybody good with that? So your code just may, if you got a different version here, your next code is going to look a little bit different. Okay? It's just going to have that different version. So what I need to do is go to package.json, and I've already made this change so I can show you what it is. I put it in here in package.json just above the browser list. You specify the engines. Engines is an object. You say node. Here I'm saying 16.9.1 because that's what came in the console form. So if it's like 16.7, it's going to be 16.7. So you need to add that key in. That's going to tell it what version of Node does Heroku need to run against. Honestly, that's something you may want to add to your backend as well. Is also on the backend, you may want Heroku to know what version of Node that you're running in. That guarantees that you're running in the same version that you're testing against. Yeah.
You said this is something over when you have installed and you try building it on your own local machine. Will it ask you to update Node or change Node version?
So if I put something else here, Heroku's just going to use that version.
Okay, what about your local machine? Will it ask you to?
Well, your local machine is going to use the version that's installed. Your local ignores this. Your local is going to ignore that. Okay. Which I'm not sure how your backend got in there, but maybe I put it in the instructions at some point. That's one thing we have to do. Okay. So that's going to get you past one of the errors. Okay. If you make that change, you're going to commit it and you're going to push it. So in my case, we just did some stuff with local storage. So I'm going to make a commit here, local storage, commit, and push it up. Because I've turned on automatic deploys, that should automatically kick off a deploy. To see the automatic deploy that's going on, go over to activity, and then it'll be up here in a minute in the activity feed. There it is. So in the activity feed, you see it says build in progress. Okay. If you click into view build progress, you can see what's actually going on and watch it as it's going. And so take a look at that, hold it up, see that it goes through successfully with the engine in it. If it still gives you an error, please put your hand up and we'll be right by you to troubleshoot. We're trying to do the issue cover. We're trying to get the issue cover. Go back to the book. So, the issue tracker. Okay. Why do you have that? How do you use that? That must be fine. Probably use Drive or something. So we added that. So go ahead and make you've got here. Push that. Go ahead and push. That looks like a lot of changes. That's part of the problem. There's a bunch of trouble. So let's check everything out. Did it be successful? Yeah. Oh, awesome. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just checking for everybody. If you go to, once this finishes, go to Open App, and you should be able to get to it. There's a little bit more I had to do to make it work, so go ahead and test it. Mainly go check that the login screen works. Actually, let me do it this way. Try to log in. If the login is successful, then raise your hand. So I know he's not going to know. So this is running on their server, right? So it should be talking with your API. Okay. That's what I want to see. That's what I see. You have it now. Okay. Try to log in. Okay. So you got it. So depending on how you have things set up, you might have gotten network error when you try to get log in, or it might have gone to yours went through, this went through, yours go through. Okay. So we've got half of the package. So yours is not working. Yours errored out. Okay, so we have 2 errors out. Okay, so here's what I had to do to kind of make mine work. Because mine did not work out of the box. When I hit login, it just spit back to me login error. In fact, let me change something here just to show and demonstrate what it did for me. So, depending on how you may have set things up previously,
So it's not working, the login's not working for some people?
For some people, it's not.
Can you explain why?
Yeah, I'm trying to get this. I just changed one of the environment variables to reproduce it. Okay. So when I hit login here, and go into the console. That's interesting. Why did that work? Because it shouldn't have worked. I don't have a backend running locally. So that's not, or actually I do have a backend running locally, but that shouldn't make a difference. Let me see terminal. Let me just check that that's not the case. I don't think that that's what's up either way, but I can kill it. That's interesting. Oh, because I didn't hit save. That's why, I think. Okay, so that's not actually triggering. So I need to actually do a deploy then to get it to where it was. So one of the things that may have happened, and I had this issue, is that it didn't pull up the correct URL to the API. So I think some people, it might be pulling up local storage, or it might be pulling up, hopefully it's pulling up from what you've got in .env.production, but what in .env production might or might not be right. So that could be part of it. If you have the wrong URL.
I had my backend sort of running whenever I did it. And then I shut it off.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I think having a server running.
Okay. So that is an impact then. Okay. So it is going back. Got it. So I'm going to build this here. Settings. I'm going to delete those keys. So going to activity. So I'm trying to get back to what you should be seeing. Yeah, so there's definitely a bit that it has to do to actually do the deploy.
Should we set config variables?
We do want to set config variables. That's what I'm getting to. So I wanted to reproduce the error first. And that's what, there it goes. So I think for a number of people, it's falling back to your local host. And this way is why it's saying network errors, because it tried to ping that, and it's like, well, it failed to do that. Now, in mine here, you can kind of see the error that get is it tried to type into the thing I had set as the environment variable, and then it failed. So what we want to do is just go over to settings, go to reveal config vars. There are two, remember we set some config vars on the backend project too, so there's just two that we need to set here. One is we want to set the node env, node _env, and we're going to specifically set that to production. That's going to cause it to do some more optimizations with how the server runs and how it builds out. So we want to turn node env to production, and I also want to set the URL for the backend. So what I did, see if I can go find the project, go find there. So React API URL was the key that I used. React App API URL. So what's going to be on the left as the key should be React app API URL. What's over on the right is going to be a little bit different from what I have, right? What's going to be on the right as the value is going to be the path to your backend. One thing to watch out for, make sure that it doesn't end in a slash. So when you're putting in the path to the API, make sure it doesn't end with a slash, and do remember that it needs to start with React app. That tells it to go and include these when it builds the application. So set that environment variable, those two environment variables, and that should make a difference. Okay. It may not make a difference immediately, but that's what we need to do. So you want to check that based on your other things. So if you open that, that will get you to the URL for it. You just have to remember to bring it in the function. Set. Yeah. Yep. Test that, see if that works. Hopefully, it's in the process of installing. Because you changed the environment variable, it's in the process of installing. So it's in the process of or you can watch the one. You watch the one. Yes. So you're so far behind with any of the work that's being done. So we can come back and refresh. So did that work? Back in? You have any explanation? You never say that. Remember, it's the production for the node environment and not local host for the. So you're going to map out. So you want to do it for the local environment. Cancel. So you're going to have to tell it, you need to go back to or you set this to so this is fine. This is fine. It shouldn't be that way. And you need to go back and change it. So this is the actual. So let's do this. So that's settings. Right. Don't touch it. Don't touch it. So this is what we're trying to change. And so this is where we're saying, where is it actually going? So, assuming you have those things in there correctly, let's do a refresh. So we should now leave this code. Because those won't have an effect on this refresh. Oh, and no. Because it has to update it to the reason update. Alright. So now. Yes. Okay, so now we're looking at, let's go up, and we're looking at, and see if you can log in. If you can log in, then you're good. So, that's not probably an issue with the setup. That's an issue with the backend. Yes. Yep. Okay, what are you doing now? Okay, good. Thanks, man. Okay. So offhand, that looks like it might be right, but we can't, we need to turn. So, first things first, you go to your application, it's live, you need to refresh it, make sure that it's all in the thing. Because otherwise, if you do version changes, we'll see it. So you need to F12, and you go to the console and see the consoles. So the console will be used a lot. So it's making a request to this, okay? And saying, I can't get to them, okay? So it's either force, as it's saying, or it's a case that you are told. Okay? So what I want you to do is click on that URL. Okay, so the server is blank. So what's missing is you haven't installed Forge in the back. So go to package.json first. Oh, it is there. Okay, so what you need to do is a hard refresh. So the Forge is in the back. So you right click on that and do a hard reload. And try it again. So the Forge code is here. So that's the one that we need. That's good. Now, it's possible that you have pushed those changes or made those changes. So you want to go to the back end and move the forward back end and see if that helps. You finish?
Yeah. I didn't have
Yeah, so definitely turn on the voice with that one. So, we're going to go open out. And see if we can work this. That's basically all, like, the big gotcha is we have to remember sets and set them in the right way. So there's another thing in there that I ended up having to do, mainly in terms of when we're looking at here. You might notice that if you look at Heroku, you'll notice that underneath the config vars, there's another section here called build packs. Okay. Now, probably what you're going to see there under build packs is that Heroku's automatically detected your project as Node. Okay. I had an issue there. Let me clear out what I had here. Let me build pack Node. there. So this is probably what you're seeing here, is Heroku/Node.js, because it just picked up and figured out that it was Node, okay? There's actually a build pack. The problem with this is if you run it this way, it always runs in development mode, always runs with the development server, which isn't ideal. So if we change the build pack, there's another build pack out there that works better with Create React App, which is what we're basing things on. And so what I want you to do is delete that build pack. You're going to hit the X and say remove the build pack. Okay. So get rid of the build pack. And then when you come back in, you're going to type in this value. So you're going to type in Mars slash, okay, so Mars is actually the name of a GitHub repo. I'm going to add the link in here so you can take a look at the repo if you want to. Okay, and I'll link that in Discord if you're curious about reading up on this at all. But there's not too much we need to do with it. But the value, anyway, is Mars slash create dash React dash app. So that's the value you're going to put there. Oh, and it went away. Mars create React app. If you switch over to that build pack, it's going to be a little bit more optimized and it should run faster and you should not see some of the development messages in the front end. Cool. So add that in there. When you hit save changes, you're going to see it turns into a different value. It's going to tell you that it's going to change into something else. It's going to only apply. Sorry, it's only going to apply once you have once you redeploy. So you want to go do another manual deploy to have that take effect. So save changes here. It's going to turn into that long AWS URL. Yes?
Is this on the back end app or the front?
This is on the front end. Make sure on the back end that it still is Node.js. If you do this on the back end, this will cause problems. So only do this on the front end. So on the front end, that's what we want it to be. And you're going to go to deploy and hit deploy branch here, and that should be it. You're all good to go. So those are the kind of gotchas that I had to walk through. I had to set the engines in the package.json. I had to set some environment variables, and I also had to switch the build pack to get it to behave the way that I wanted it to behave. So just some heads up about how to set that. Cool. That's it. That's all I wanted to talk about today. Is get the local storage figured out and get your things, get your front ends up on Heroku so those things are live. Cool. And that means that anybody can get access to it. Now, when you're done with this, I do need you to send me the URL for your front ends. So send it to me over Discord when you get this up and running. Okay. Because I need all those. I think I also need you to add me as a collaborator to these, if I remember right. Access, yeah. So under collaborator, you want to add me in there as well. It should send me an invite. But either way, I need a URL for both your. I need a URL for your backend and your front end.
Wants to publish it to the general chat or and referencing?
I'm okay with either one. I would prefer the direct message because it's easier for me to find it again that way. It's harder to hunt down in the general chat. but I need access to both your front end and your back end.
So it's not like something that I don't have to do back end.